1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam, fantasy fam? Welcome back to the DFS Lab. I am your host. Today, I am also your guest, JM to Win. If you are new to this show, typically we have Keegan on, but with the winter weather bearing down across the country, Keegan had to rescue his wife from work, so I'm flying solo today. We are going to be building another roster, though. If you have not watched episodes 1 and 2 of the DFS Lab this week, I encourage you to do that. Part of the value of this exercise is seeing the way that our roster builds develop throughout the week, the way that our thoughts develop throughout the week. If you're a longtime 1 week season member, one of the things that you've heard me talk about a lot is building a lot of practice builds and making the slate flexible for yourself. And part of that is just getting in here and seeing how different players piece together, forcing ourselves onto different things, uncovering the key questions on the slate, and kind of finding what those strategies are that can allow us to maneuver past the field toward a first place finish. So it's this sort of day in and day out routine that can really help us a lot. And it doesn't have to be incredibly time consuming, right? It can be 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there, and just sort of piles up throughout the week. So again, encourage you to go back and look at episodes 1 and 2. Those were recorded on Tuesday and Wednesday. This is Thursday. Obviously, we have a main slate on Saturday this week. So the week comes at us a little bit fast here. We're hoping to get closer and closer to our main thoughts at this point in the week. Throw this podcast, this video on 1.75x speed, or since it's just me talking, 2x speed also works. That's what I always recommend on OWS. And let's dive into this roster build. So the first thing I want to talk about is the weather this week. And you can see it in the tops of these tabs, right? Where we've got sunny in Houston and Tennessee and sunny in Atlanta and Baltimore, but these don't tell the full story, right? So this week we're expecting, in fact, what I've been reading is winds that are high enough to impact football in Baltimore, certainly winds that are high enough to impact football in Chicago, certainly winds that are high enough to impact football in Cleveland. In fact, the over-under prop for Andy Dalton passing yards as of last night, as of Wednesday night, was 150.5 yards. I believe he's topped that in every single game this season. Deshaun Watson was somewhere in that same range, and that led me digging into how bad is the weather in this spot. And the weather is pretty bad. We should expect both teams to keep the ball on the ground, especially two teams that don't mind keeping the ball on the ground. And so with all of this, we have this 10-game slate, and it's a smaller slate than that because there are a lot of spots that are kind of moved off the board because of the weather, or at least the way that these teams are going to attack is going to be different because of the weather. So you are going to get a deeper sense of that as you move deeper into the weekend. Again, at this point, we are mostly reaching OWS members with this. So you're used to being on the site throughout the weekend. And as you know, we will be diving into each individual spot in the NFL Edge and the scroll and kind of getting a clear sense of where are the spots that we should be trying to avoid and what are the spots that we might be trying to lean into a bit more heavily. Next thing I want to talk about is I have a pretty narrow quarterback list right now this week. So obviously I'll dive into this more deeply on the Angles podcast. But right now it's Mahomes, Burrow, Geno, Jared Goff, and Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones is a particularly interesting one on the slate like this, where we have only 20 games. We have several spots where the quarterbacks are probably out of play for us. We don't have Gardner Minshew might be on my list as well, but we don't have Jalen Hurts playing in this Philadelphia and Dallas game. We have Brock Purdy, a team where San Francisco would love to throw the ball only 25 times if they can, playing against a team that's going to have a tough time moving the ball against this San Francisco defense, a tough time piling up quarterback points. We have Mac Jones, who's playing pretty poorly recently in this pretty poor Patriots offense going against Cincinnati. His chances of putting up a win you the slate type of score, 25, 30-pointer, are pretty low. We have Kirk Cousins, who is opposite Daniel Jones, is also interesting, probably not going to be on my tighter list this week. We'll get into that deeper into the weekend, obviously. We've got the Seattle-Kansas City game with two quarterbacks I mentioned. We have this New Orleans-Cleveland game with the wind, probably both teams keeping the ball on the ground. Buffalo, Chicago, a lot of bad weather. Both teams probably keeping the ball on the ground. Detroit at Carolina, obviously Sam Darnold, not a guy we expect to put up a 25 to 30-pointer. He is in the mix in large field play because he can do that, especially against the Detroit defense. But in terms of tighter builds, not a guy I'm going toward. And then Jared Goff, already mentioned in that game. Atlanta, Baltimore, looks like Hundley's going to be starting again. Desmond Ridder, two teams that would like to keep the ball on the ground. We talked in the second DFS Lab this week about how Baltimore forces the ball to the air quite a bit. Only San Francisco and Tennessee force a higher opponent pass play rate. So there should be some passing from Atlanta, which can help Drake London. He has a 46% target share the last 2 weeks, which is just absolutely absurd. 50 total pass attempts, and he has 23 targets. So he can certainly in a 28, 29, 30 pass attempt game end up with double-digit targets. So he's interesting there, but not high likelihood that we see enough passing from this passing attack from the quarterback for the quarterback to be viable. Houston, we've got kind of the mixing and matching these quarterbacks. Tennessee, we have Malik Willis, who threw 10 and 16 passes his previous 2 starts. And unless they fall far behind Houston, that will be their game plan again in this spot. So as you see, it's a very small quarterback pool already created for us. There are a couple guys that we left off here. There was Kirk Cousins, there was Sam Darnold, but really this pool, there was Gardner Minshew not on this tighter list, which I'm sort of back and forth on that one. I'm totally comfortable playing Gardner Minshew at 4,800. But again, this gives us this very small list of Mahomes, Burrow, Geno, Daniel Jones, Jared Goff. So Daniel Jones, interesting. He has those a 29-pointer, a 30-pointer under his belt this year. He's 5,600. He's the type of guy who people don't typically click that button. But if Minnesota's scoring points, if he's falling behind, then he could be an interesting piece this week. Speaking of Minnesota potentially taking a lead, one of the things I was digging into last night, there have been 3 games this year where Dalvin Cook plus Justin Jefferson, in spite of their high price tags, where Dalvin Cook plus Justin Jefferson went for just under 4x their combined salary, or as high as exactly 4x their combined salary. So when we think about how difficult it is to find guys who keep you on that 200-point pace, and then how difficult it is to find that with a large block of your salary. Well, I was looking at Dalvin Cook last night and thinking, well, I'm always saying, well, Dalvin Cook can't get us 35, but he's 7,200. If he can get us 28 on a week like this, he actually becomes pretty interesting. And then I was thinking, so is that an either or between him and Justin Jefferson? Well, Dalvin Cook has 4 games of 26 to 28 DraftKings points. In 3 of those, Justin Jefferson also hit. So it sort of brings us back to the old Derrick Henry, A.J. Brown, Ryan Tannehill thing, where it was like this entire offense would hit and you could get 100-plus points from those 3 guys, where people would think of those as being mutually exclusive plays, right? Derrick Henry didn't catch a lot of passes, and so if you're playing him, you don't play A.J. Brown, you don't play Ryan Tannehill. But it's been that same sort of situation with the Vikings, where you would think that, but it's sort of these Vikings score a lot of points type of games have been the games where Dalvin Cook has hit. So again, 3 of Dalvin Cook's 4 games where he hit. Justin Jefferson also hit for, I think it was 33-plus points in all of them, and you combine those scores, roughly 4x their salary in 3 different games this year. So that's a very interesting way to play that game. And in fact, there's a starting point for every roster in my mind. But what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to go ahead and start this roster with Daniel Jones. If I'm saying that Daniel Jones puts up 30-ish points, I also want to throw in one of his pass catchers. So that can be Darius Slayton or Isaiah Hodgins. As we talked about on the show this week, Isaiah Hodgins, he has these couple 14-point games recently, but both of them came with a touchdown. So that has sort of artificially elevated his price tag. We still see 6 targets, 4 targets. With that said, and not topping 44 yards in these games. So with that said, he's actually the player I'm going to throw in here. Typically, I would look to throw in Darius Slayton on this build, but you're going to see why I'm doing this, because I'm also completing this entire bet with Dalvin Cook, with Justin Jefferson. So I'm basically saying Vikings score a lot of points, and then Daniel Jones and Darius Slayton are able to get something going in response. We know that Daniel Jones can get points with his legs. That's typically how he gets these 30-pointers. And I think he had no 30-pointers last year, but heading into last year, it was year in and year out, he'd have these 2, 3, 4. I think one year, I think it was his rookie year, he had like maybe as many as 4 or 5 of these 30-pointers. He's capable of doing this, but typically it comes from him breaking off long runs. But he's going to break off these long runs more than likely in a game environment where they're chasing points, where he's having to throw the ball downfield, where the offense is getting more aggressive, and every once in a while he's not seeing anything he's taking out of the pocket. Also, they have some designed runs in their game plan for Daniel Jones. So if they are falling behind in Minnesota, kind of compels them to get a little bit more aggressive in this spot. Okay, so I've talked all week that we basically have to make a decision on every roster. Are we playing Derrick Henry or are we not playing Derrick Henry? In my mind, that's the first critical decision point on every roster. So why is that? We haven't really dived into the numbers just yet on this show. 4 consecutive starts against Houston. 4 consecutive starts. Derrick Henry has rushed for at least 211 yards and scored at least 2 touchdowns. 4 consecutive games where Tennessee has played Houston, Derrick Henry has rushed for 211 plus yards and 2 plus touchdowns. Now, interestingly, his value has been, we talked about this on the show yesterday, but his value has been rising in the past game. He's averaged 6.65 DraftKings points per game through the air over his last 6 games. But in the 2 starts with Malik Willis earlier this year, he averaged 0.95. He had 1 catch for 9 yards in one of those games, 0 catches in the other game. Makes sense, right? Malik Willis threw the ball 26 total times across 2 games. So that's like a full extra touchdown that Derrick Henry has to get here to make up for that receiving work that he's going to likely lose in this spot. And yet, when we look at his history against Houston, those numbers really pop, right? I mean, 200 yards, you give him the bonus, that's 23 points. And then 2 touchdowns, that's 35 points already. And you give him those extra 10 yards, those extra 30, those extra 40 yards. He has some 250-yard games against Houston. That can get him up close to that 40-point range, which is really in that had-to-have-it type of range, especially on a week like this. Now, another player who can put up 40 points is Justin Jefferson. So we can play Justin Jefferson instead of Derrick Henry, recognizing that a lot of Derrick Henry rosters will not be able to fit in Justin Jefferson. They won't play Derrick Henry and then say, how do I fit in Justin Jefferson? So that's a very unique way to go, is say, hey, maybe we get both of the 40-pointers on this slate. Christian McCaffrey, also a guy capable of 40 points. I almost looked down at my phone to pull up these numbers, but I can pull them right up on the screen for you today. But we can keep in mind also 8 targets, 10 targets, 3 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets. Now, these 6, 7 targets where Elijah Mitchell was playing, but we're kind of looking at him being this 8 to 9 target guy. And that's sort of some Ramondre Stevenson type of usage, right? Where Christian McCaffrey he's Christian McCaffrey right now. He's Christian McCaffrey again, but he's not getting the 14 target games, which makes sense because you still have George Kittle on this offense. You still have Brandon Ayuk on this offense. They still want to keep the ball on the ground on this offense. On the ground, he's facing a really tough Washington run defense. So these 14 to 26 carries, these 17 carries, we could end up with one of these 17 for 66 yards types of games, right? Where his rushing output isn't really what's winning you a tournament, and he has to get stuff going through the air. So I could very much see him putting up one of these 28.6, 28.8, 32.3 type games and not being a had-to-have-it piece. Now, very much so, I could also see him having a had-to-have-it game, but I think his pathways to that type of game are less clear than Derrick Henry's pathways to that type of game. So very much keeping Christian McCaffrey in mind this week, very much mixing Christian McCaffrey into a lot of these practice builds this week, but just wanted to sort of touch on those deeper numbers there, whereas with Derrick Henry, we can see he's done it 4 games in a row against Houston, these 35 to 40-point games. The path for Christian McCaffrey doing that is a little bit muddier, but Christian McCaffrey can certainly do that as well. So on this particular build, though, we started out with this Vikings and Giants block. But the reason we went Isaiah Hodgins is because I want to say on this roster, I'm going to make this starting point decision of Derrick Henry. Yes, on Derrick Henry on this roster. Now, it's also worth noting that the 5th game in this stretch, we've got 4 consecutive games where Derrick Henry's gone for 200 plus yards and 2 plus touchdowns. Well, there was a game before that, before this stretch started, where he rushed for 86 yards, 0 touchdowns. I believe it was 0 receptions in that game. So 8.6 points in that game. Houston, I believe, was playing from in front in that one. I have to dig back in that one again, and I'll cover that on the Angles podcast, obviously. But so certainly it would be a certain game flow type of scenario where that happens. But if you're Houston, if Malik Willis is under center, you are throwing everything at the line of scrimmage, knowing that the Titans are going to ride Derrick Henry in this one. That doesn't necessarily mean they stop Derrick Henry, but it could mean that Derrick Henry rushes for, again, we're taking out the receiving work this week by and large. So it could mean that Derrick Henry ends up rushing for 120 yards and 1 touchdown. That's 21 DraftKings points. Doesn't kill you for not having him, especially at this high price tag. But again, this is a decision that we want to make on every single roster. We need to be aware of the fact that we need to account for whether or not we're playing Derrick Henry. If I'm not playing Derrick Henry, I want to try to significantly outscore him, right? Certainly he can have one of those 8.6-point games, but more than likely he still gets over 100 yards. More than likely he still gets 1 touchdown. So he's still in that 20-point range, 20 to 25-point range, even in a disappointing game. So if I'm not playing him, I want to make sure I'm accounting for who is the player that the other Derrick Henry, most of the Derrick Henry rosters won't have, that I can then say, okay, this guy can then outscore those 20 to 25 points from Derrick Henry. So that's where Christian McCaffrey's value really rises this week. That's where Justin Jefferson's value really rises this week. Stephon Diggs, again, in this bad weather game. Jamar Chase. We dove into the numbers last week for Devontae Adams. The Patriots have not shut down wide receivers the way that the Jets have. We look through Jets game logs, and it's like every single elite wide receiver against the Jets, and they've played almost every elite wide receiver. All of them are getting 8-point DraftKings games, 14-point DraftKings games, 16-point games. Whereas the Patriots, Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs and Justin Jefferson, these guys are still putting up solid games, but they're not putting up the had-to-have-it games. We haven't seen one of these 35 to 40 pointers against the Patriots, which makes sense. Tremendous defense overall. We talked last week about the way that they play defense and why that opens up some opportunities for wide receivers. So I'm not scared of playing Jamar Chase this week, but I'm also not scared of missing out on whatever production Jamar Chase might have. In other words, I certainly expect him to have one of these 18 to 22 to 25 point games. That's very much within his range of outcomes, but it's harder for me to see him putting up a 30, 35 pointer. So when we look at his price tag at 8,300 right next to Derrick Henry, he's not a guy who's really popping to me as much this week. AJ Brown is an interesting one in here because he can put up a 30 to 40 pointer sort of out of nowhere. Gardner Minshew's under center, but that doesn't mean that he can't distribute the ball. Gardner Minshew, I think it's 41 career touchdowns, 12 career interceptions, a very capable, quote, backup quarterback. He would be an upgrade at starter for a lot of teams in the NFL. And we see this sometimes, right, where a lot of teams in the NFL have a bad starter, but it's because they're skewing toward youth and trying to see if, hey, maybe this guy can become our future. Turns out this guy is not going to be our future. And now there's a backup quarterback out there that's way better than your team. So Gardner Minshew is past the point where any team is like, hey, maybe he can lead us to a championship. And so because of that, he's relegated to backup duties, but he's a better starter than half of the starters out there, or at least a third of the starters out there. So Gardner Minshew in this Eagles offense with these Eagles weapons, I certainly like him. I certainly like the pieces of this Eagles passing attack. But that kind of shows us that by and large, and we already talked about Dalvin Cook, right? It's kind of been capped at about 28 points in his big games this year. So if you're not playing Derrick Henry, there's a thought. We had this thought on yesterday's show where it's like, hey, just skew down, totally different salary structure. We did DeAndre Swift and Jerick McKinnon. I actually really like that for some reasons that I'll talk about tomorrow with Keegan. But if you're doing that, you still have to think about, hey, where can we get one of these scores that outscores Derrick Henry? So I believe we ended up with Justin Jefferson on that roster yesterday, ending up with him today, but paired with Derrick Henry. So now we have to see how we can make this happen. As we've seen on the show, what we like to do once we get some of the salary in place is go down to a defense and then say, what can this open up for us now that we're playing one of these defenses down here? So I'm going to go ahead and throw in the Patriots defense on this one. We could go cheaper than this, but a Patriots defense that we haven't really talked about yet on this show, averaging 11.1 DraftKings points per game, playing at home, playing against an excellent quarterback, obviously, in Joe Burrow, but he can be had for sacks. He doesn't he doesn't throw many interceptions, but the Patriots are good at forcing turnovers, 22 forced turnovers on the year. We see this 48 sacks, 6 defense special teams touchdowns. When we see something like that, that can feel fluky until you watch these teams and you see that certain teams are always sort of forward moving in their defensive game plan. So teams like the 49ers, teams like the Eagles, teams like the Patriots, they're always moving toward the opposing offense. They're always aggressively attacking, which again can lead to some big plays, that leads to more turnovers, and it also leads to more turnovers that go the other way for a touchdown. So these defenses that kind of sit back, they're going to force some turnovers, but they're less likely to force these turnovers in such a way that they are then having a clear path to scoring a touchdown. So the Patriots, this 6 defense special teams touchdown, that's not going to be a year in and year out thing, but it's also not totally fluky. So this Patriots defense 2,700, one that I like a lot, one that I especially like if we're saving salary and trying to be different and trying to get some upside on this roster. That brings us over to the tight end position, where really, honestly, things are pretty thin. I think we've had Noah Fant on both of our builds so far. When you get below Travis Kelce, things get really thin. We don't expect Baltimore to be throwing the ball a lot in this spot with Hundley under center again. George Kittle, certainly viable, but playing against a Washington defense that's been good against tight ends, playing in a game where San Francisco will probably control things. And we've seen Brock Purdy throw 21 and 26 passes in these games that the 49ers have controlled. TJ Hawkinson, he gets priced up here because he had this 42 pointer. He had a 39 pointer, I think it was last year. But you look at the rest of his games, right? And it's 12 to 15 to 16 points. This is very much a 3.9K tight end outside of this one huge game in terms of what his role is, in terms of what his production has been. Dallas Goedert is very interesting, but again, we looked at this already this week. A lot of 12, 13, 14, 15 pointers. So there's a pretty good shot that you spend $4,500 and get 2 to 3x his salary. He had this 27 pointer in here. He's certainly capable of that. Cole Kmet in a game where we don't expect a ton of passing volume. Same thing with Njoku. Dalton Schultz, very interesting, but in a very tough matchup. Dawson Knox in a game where we don't expect a ton of passing volume. Juwan Johnson in a game where we don't expect a ton of passing volume. Chigo Konko in a game where we don't expect a ton of passing volume. And then we've got Noah Fant, who, again, we've already used twice, but really he's still going to get 5, 6 targets, maybe 7 targets, a lot of short area targets. He has this one game this year where he had 96 receiving yards. And then early in the year, 49 and 45, they're kind of figuring out how to use him. But as we've gone throughout the season, 19 yards, 34, 34, 42, 0, 32. So we're kind of looking at probably 4 catches, 32 yards, something in that range. Maybe he breaks up a long play. Maybe he gets an extra reception. Maybe he scores a touchdown. But it's not like he's some smash play down here. So just really wide open at the tight end position, which gives us an opportunity that we could just go really cheap, right? Somebody like Jordan Akins, where we can say, hey, the Texans are going to be passing the ball against Tennessee. Every team has to pass the ball against Tennessee. Tennessee has not had a great season at defending tight ends. Looks like Brandon Cooks will be back this week, but Nico Collins will not. So I'm actually going to throw Jordan Akins in here at 2,900. Daniel Bellinger is another guy I've put in one of these Daniel Jones practice builds on my end, but a lot of short area work, right? So the chances of him having a big game are pretty low. It's more with Daniel Bellinger. Hey, maybe he catches a bunch of short area targets, piles up some PPR points, scores a touchdown. Whereas Jordan Akins could actually break off a long game and end up posting a really nice score. And so as we see all of a sudden, with going down at defense, with going down at tight end, we have this flexibility, salary flexibility. We've got 9,600 in salary left over. We could actually, if we wanted to find like a 3K wide receiver, we could actually pay still 6,600 for somebody like Devontae Smith. We could play somebody like, I guess we're not playing David Montgomery. Let's see who else is in this price range. We've got Kenneth Walker probably chasing points there. We got Chris Olave, probably low passing volume in that game. Same thing with Amari Cooper, low passing volume in that game. Jerick McKinnon, very interesting in this spot. Juju Smith-Schuster, very interesting in this spot. But we see this kind of flexibility that we have once we've made this move. But what I want to do is not sacrifice my cheaper guys. So I am going to come down here and see if there's a way to play Marquise Goodwin and still have a piece that I like in the flex position. So what this brings us down to actually is it's pretty interesting. We saw this on our first show this week. We drop into a different tier when we get below 5,500. Right here in 5,500, we have DeAndre Swift, who, let's keep in mind, when he's been off the injury report, 14 carries, 4 receptions, 15 carries, 3 receptions. Those are the 2 games when he's been completely off the injury report and not had limited practices throughout the week. He was off the injury report last week, but he had a couple of limited practices. And in that one, 8 carries and 5 receptions, 9 targets, right? And this is the sort of usage that he was seeing in the past where we don't care that much about the carries because that's 4 or 5 yards per carry. So give him an extra 8 carries. That's just an extra 4 points. What we really care about is the opportunities for these explosive plays, which are likelier to come through the air, these PPR points, and can he get the touchdowns? We know he can get the touchdowns. He has 6 of them on the year in spite of playing limited snaps. Even though Jamal Williams is kind of the vulture down there, DeAndre Swift still gets these opportunities, including in close to the goal line, carries inside the 10-yard line, even some carries inside the 5. So DeAndre Swift is very interesting at 5,500, and we've been building around this Lions game a decent amount this week on this show. So DJ Moore is also pretty interesting, right? Only 6 targets against Pittsburgh, only 6 targets against Denver. But if they are compelled to throw the ball a little bit more in this spot, he put up these 23.3, 18.3 points, obviously scored a touchdown in those games. But if the Panthers are compelled to throw the ball a little bit more, he's interesting here. So let's see if there's anybody here that we could go to without sort of shifting up our entire salary structure. We could go Darius Slayton and see if there's somebody we want to go to instead of Isaiah Hodgins. In fact, I will go in that direction first. So if we go Darius Slayton, we're going to have to save 100. We're going to spend 4K, and we're going to do it wide receiver because there are no 4K running backs. So are there any wide receivers over here? Nobody who's really standing out. Oh, there it is, Jahan Dotson right there. I'm going to do that, actually. So I am going to pivot off of Isaiah Hodgins. I am going to put, actually, Jahan Dotson is playing in a late game. So let me scroll up to Darius Slayton, put him in at wide receiver. And then over here in the flex spot, I am going to put in Jahan Dotson. Jahan Dotson, where we talk about pricing psychology, right? Let's look at his scores this season. 18 points in week 1, 17.9 in week 2, 13.3 in week 4, coming back from injury, limited snaps here, then 16.4 and 23.5. Now, there are touchdowns in all of these games, but the fact that this rookie wide receiver has scored 6 touchdowns while playing, really, he got injured in this Dallas game. So he played like 3.5 games. I don't remember how early he got injured in that game. So we'll call it 4 games. Limited snaps here, and then 2 additional games. So 6 touchdowns, 6 games really played. And Jahan Dotson's really good. If he'd been playing all season, especially if he had been playing all season on a functional offense, we would expect his price tag to be up around 5,800, maybe 6,300, 6,400 at this point. So this pricing psychology has him down here, but he's a very different player than what this shows. And what this gives us now is this Daniel Jones Darius Slayton pairing, where their chances of scoring 60 are low, but they're capable of scoring 60. Their clearest pathway to scoring 60 is in a game where the Vikings are putting up a lot of points, forcing the Giants to be more aggressive throughout. We know that the Vikings defense doesn't scare us that much as long as the Giants are being aggressive. So how did the Vikings get out to a big enough lead? Well, we've got Dalvin Cook and Justin Jefferson, who again, 3 times this year have paired for 4x their salary. So now we've got this completed bet where we're hoping for about 60 to 65 points from Dalvin and Jefferson. We're hoping that that leads to 60 points from Daniel Jones and Darius Slayton. They haven't done it yet this year, but Daniel Jones has a couple 30-pointers this year. Darius Slayton has plenty of 30-pointers, like a surprising number of 30-pointers on his resume. I think it was like 3 or 4 back in 2019 that he put up that season. So he's certainly capable of that, and especially in a game where they are chasing points here. So we have hopefully 120 points from those 2 guys. We also have this unique build with Derrick Henry on a Justin Jefferson roster. We have a unique build with Dalvin Cook on a Justin Jefferson roster. We could really play chalk the rest of the way here and be totally fine. We don't have the salary to play chalk the rest of the way here. There's a piece of mustache in my mouth. We don't have the salary to play chalk the rest of the way here, but we can play Marquise Goodwin, recognize he's probably going to be popular, but is a really sharp play. We don't have to worry about that. We could open up some salary flexibility by doing something different at defense, going even cheaper, but we end up with Marquise Goodwin. We think let's give 35 points to Derrick Henry. We're up to 155 now on this roster. Marquise Goodwin can put up 15 to 20, so let's give him 20. We've got 175. Then we've got Jordan Akins, who can put up 15. We've got Jahan Dotson, who can put up 20. That puts us up to 210. And then this Patriots defense that is very capable of putting up a 15 to 20-point game in just about any matchup. So that could get us up to 220, 225. As always, these are not crazy scenarios that we're pointing. Derrick Henry's done this in 4 straight games. Daniel Jones has done this twice this year. Dalvin Cook and Justin Jefferson have done this 3 times this year. Marquise Goodwin, very clearly 15 to 20 points is in his range. Same thing with Akins. Same thing with Dotson. He's put up these 15 to 20-point games 5-6 times already this season. So very much, I guess, 5 times this season, 13 to 20 points that Dotson has put up. And then again, Patriots defense is capable of putting up 15 to 20 pointers. So we need things to go right here. That's always the case on any roster, but just a very fun build here where we have a lot of things breaking our way. We have a lot of opportunity for things to break our way. Salary actually is a little bit different than I was thinking. So we have 300 left. We could go differently at defense if we wanted, but excuse me, picked a little sickness last night going out to look at Christmas lights. But yeah, we're going to leave it at that for now. Call it a wrap. I will see you back here on Friday for the 4th edition of this week's DFS Lab. And I will see you on the site throughout the weekend. And as always, I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.